8th Chamber Debate of the 120th session of the University Elizabethan Society. Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate representation of the last private business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Madam Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Madam Secretary, are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read. The time for questions is now open.
Madam Secretary, are there any motions on notice?
There are no motions on notice. The time for questions is now closed.
This brings us on to general business of the Society. Are there any motions to be raised in general business? There being no further business, this private business meeting is adjourned. Our Secretary shall retire and return with the speakers for tonight's debate. Hear, hear.
All rise for the speakers.
Everyone, welcome again to the University Elizabethan Society, a subcommittee of the Phil for Women and Gender Minorities. I invite our registrar to read out the minutes of the last public business meeting. Hear, hear.
Therese, what's wrong?
I just, I can't.
Tell us. What's bothering you? Maybe we can talk through.
It's just that, I don't know, the world, it's so upside down right now. And I don't know what's going on. Like, men, they used to go to war and all, now all they do is lie on podcasts. And, you know, women used to work in the kitchen and now I don't know what's next for us. And I honestly, I don't like this idea at all. It's really scary to me. Like, what's gonna happen if we get drafted, right? Like, jumping jacks and jumping jack in the top bunk, or, you know, burpees and gay for the stay. Like, I can't do any of that. I mean, drafter, I hardly know her. I don't understand this motion, but I guess, you know, serving my country, serving cunts, could be fun, maybe. Draft, if they're not doing IPA, I could go for one, I don't know. Register, like a cash register, maybe. You know, I used to work at a clothing shop, so I could do a pretty good spiel, not to brag. Because, you know, when people go in the store, you know, you're standing in the front pretending to fold, and you go, "Hi, welcome in, let me know if you need anything." So maybe the Army has a greeter position like that. I think I could actually be good at that, you know, like, Semper Fi, the only easy day was yesterday, but there's way less mud today, people. So turn that frown upside down. And, you know, low-key, Jack is foobar. But anyways, it's not that deep. Like, we have other people who can take his place, so it's totally fine, you know, whatever it takes. Like, unironically, live free or die, guys. I can't really picture anything else I'd be doing. Like, I could do that, but I definitely couldn't, like, drive a tank because, you know, driving, me, biology, like, as a woman with horrible eyesight, you don't want me on the roads, you know? But, you know, there are definitely women who can do the grunt work. You know, I don't want to, but, like, Sive clearly does, you know? I don't think we should be made to do anything, but I'm willing to consider it. When I looked at the Google AI summary on women registering for the draft, it used sources like military.com, which seemed really sound to me. But still, it didn't feel like it was getting at the truth, you know, the real facts and feeling of the cases for side, proposition, and opposition. So, of course, I then went on to r/equality on Reddit, discussing this question, and I think it'll be easier if I just read out some responses for you all. Number 1, countries need babies. Who thinks we need more babies? Yeah, I don't know about that one. Number 2, the women that do go into the military are often not prepared for it physically. There was no need for intensive workouts, sleep schedule, and strict diet beforehand, whereas a lot of men already do aforementioned workouts to some degree and only need diet and sleep adjusted. So I don't know if you all know James. James is kind of an enigma to me, but I'm pretty sure his diet is just red wine and cigarettes, and his workout consists of walking from Afters to the George. I mean, like, this guy writing this has clearly never met a Pilates princess in his life, because those women could crush like 4 Jameses in between their thighs, and if it happened at the George, he'd probably enjoyed it. Number 3, because female privilege is real, just a lot of y'all haven't grown up yet. Sive isn't old enough to register, but once she is, we're gonna have words. Number 3, Because, I might have said that already, because feminists don't really want equality. They want the benefits of being male without the burdens. Because gender equality only exists when where it benefits women. You'll never see a feminist fighting for real equality, just privilege. That's the most of the responses that we got in this thread. And I think that's what we're really discussing today, right? The crux of the issue. Is it unfeminist of us to not want to join the draft? Is joining the draft a step towards equality, or is it a step back? Hopefully, our speakers tonight will give us some clarity. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful speakers. On side proposition, we have James Prendergast, second-year engineering student, and Phil Proauteur. We have Layla Cummings, a first-year law and political science student, and Sive Kavanaugh, a first-year law and German student, as well as Phil Maiden's finalist. So if we could all please give a round of applause. On side opposition tonight, we have Jemima Eastwood, third-year PPS student and Eliz debates convener, Maya Hagstrom, third-year English student, and our guest speaker, independent senator and former Irish Army Captain Tom Clonan, a man who is actually qualified to speak on women's issues, and we are grateful to have him here with us tonight. Thank you.
The motion that stands before the House tonight is this House would make women register for the draft. Standing orders are as follows. Speeches are a maximum of 7 minutes, 10 minutes for guest speakers, after the first minute and before the last minute of each speech, which will be signified by a bell. Speakers from opposing sides and audience members are free to offer points of information. We encourage general audience participation during our debates. If you hear something you like, you can shout "hear, hear," and if you hear something you don't like, you can shout "nay." We prioritize respect during our debates, and as a result, if anyone has any concerns about what is said tonight, you can contact me at eliz@tcdphil.com or our Diversity and Welfare Officer Tanvi at elizdiversityandwelfare@tcdphil.com. I now invite James Prendergast to open the case for side proposition and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hello. Before I get into the real meat and potato of my speech, I'd like to thank Maren and the Eliz for allowing me to speak tonight. I was slightly confused when Maren approached me saying she was debating participating for the draft. Fourth year was hard, of course, as she called me countless times up and Bram, and the job market isn't great, as I'm sure we all know. It's gotten so bad, actually, that the Phil's very own registrar, Fionn Graham, has resorted to an Instagram comedy account, just in case his law degree doesn't work out. But Maren, professional basketball isn't the solution. The transition from 5'1" president of a debating society to WNBA power forward doesn't seem a particularly well-trodden path. Upon clarifying my confusions with her, she queried whether I was serious before expressing that she was actually talking about the military draft. However, not everyone has been as sympathetic to me as Maren to my confusion surrounding tonight's debate topic. When I received confirmation that I was speaking last Thursday, I was extremely excited, both because it meant I'd be the centre of attention for 7 minutes, and who doesn't love that, but more importantly because it gave me another arrow in my quiver to strike up a conversation with one of my fellow draftees. Forget happy Valentinesing my way back into their lives, I could take it one step further. I was Wiggum debating my way back into their lives. Upon sliding back into their DMs with a screenshot of the email the Eliz Secretary Dilly sent me, along with a self-deprecating message about how intimidating it would be to speak with so many intelligent women and you, Senator, I waited. You may be asking, did this work? No, absolutely not. All I got back was this message. A man speaking on women's issues. How predictable. Much like this year's T-ball lineup, I felt like a thing of decades past. I felt like I didn't belong at the podium anymore, or at least tonight's podium. But that was until I thought about who tonight's motion really forces the hand of. Because whilst tonight's motion does force women into participating in the draft, the real group forced into battle tonight are existing male draft dodgers. It may surprise you to know that Maren isn't the first American president to debate the implications of the draft. The evil orange man who now occupies the White House also thought about the draft. So deeply, in fact, that he decided to skip the process entirely. President Trump decided the process was below him. Military service was below him. Risking his life was below him. You may be asking why, and the answer is simple. Nobody, not the state, not his family, not society, forced his hand. So he, like many wealthy American men, dodged the Vietnam War draft, as he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. This changes on our side of the house, as we weaponize their chauvinism against it. The conservative right continues to be an exceptionally sexist community, perpetuating multi-generational cycles of gender norms, which have given birth to the tradwife movement on social media. Once women start participating in the draft, and more importantly, fighting on the front line, society's perception of the male draft dodgers, like the evil orange man, start to change. The tide will turn on these wealthy men. Could you imagine the headlines if a young woman were killed defending her country while a politician's son remained safely at home? There'd be outcry. Outcry that our side of the house weaponizes into forcing these men into draft participation. The external involvement leaves draft dodgers unable to dictate their own future because that privilege has been taken away through societal pressure. Because if there's one thing that these wealthy men care more about money, or power, or perception. Oh, it's perception, sorry. There is no doubt that famous draft dodgers, like Donald Trump, would give it all up, the money, the power, the fame, so long as, in their eyes, they were perceived positively. Proposition places this under attack, as a sexist society that these men inhabit will judge them. It's one thing that they're unable to buy will be taken away. They'll be ostracized, if you will. This isn't some far-fetched dream. Many societies across the world have heavy societal pressure, and this already happens. In South Korea, people who avoid military service face heavy social stigma and can even lead to the loss of careers for certain celebrities. The stigma is so strong that the world-famous K-pop band, BTS, temporarily ceased their careers, as they knew if they didn't, they'd have no careers to return to. That's the world that Proposition wants. A world not just where the many take part, but also the few. A more equal world, even if only slightly. Moreover, by participating in the draft, women can challenge and confront the deeper, more challenging realities that continue to be perpetuated by society. I'm not talking about skirts over jeans on campus couture, I'm talking about sexism. As I previously argued, the conservative right and wider society remain invested in cycles of traditional gender norms, roles that compulsory military service would fundamentally unsettle. The enduring image of men as protectors cannot survive intact if the obligation to serve is shared equally. Imagine the defining moments of modern warfare altered. A woman raising the American flag in the Pacific Campaign. A woman leading the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. Such moments shape how nations understand courage, sacrifice, and citizenship. If the draft is the ultimate expression of civic obligation, then excluding women is not protection. It's the quiet admission that the full burden of state still falls along gender lines. True equality demands not just equal opportunity, but equal responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that very fine speech. And I now invite Jemima Eastwood to open the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
So back in 2020, during the pandemic and shutdown, there were rumors of an impending World War III and thus a draft. And TikTok soothsayers foresaw that this draft would include women, all genders rather. Obviously, 15-year-old me was terrified at the thought of imminent nuclear war, but 15-year-old me also had her priorities straight. And what was more terrifying was the thought of being drafted into the military, where I would have no access to Chloe Ting at-home ab workouts and mango-flavored Jewel pods. But this fear was short-lived because I very quickly learned that even if the draft expanded to include women, I myself would not be included. And there are loopholes and exceptions, of course. If I played my cards right, my poor eyesight, mild scoliosis, and of course, chronic anxiety would actually make me ineligible for military service. So thankfully, this debate does not apply to me. However, as an altruistic and selfless person, I've decided to stand up for all women today and oppose this motion. I like being in Eliz debates a lot for many, many reasons, but mainly because in the weeks leading up to the debates, I have loads of conversational fodder for when things get awkward in my day-to-day life. Like when neither my partner nor I had done the readings in our tutorial the other day, I was like, oh, that sucks. But anyway, do you think women should have to register for the draft? And he was kind of like, what the fuck? And then suddenly had to go to the bathroom for some reason. But another classmate I asked said something really interesting that made me think. I mean, I don't think women should be in the army anyways, but I guess if you guys want equality, it's only fair. Similar sentiments were echoed when I was doing my in-depth research on Reddit, so I guess Teresa and I had the same idea, and the philosophers of r-left-wing male politics, and of course for some diversity of opinion, r-men's rights, had loads to say about why women should register for the draft. In the majority of these posts, equality between the sexes was weaponized, and registering for the draft seemed to be taken as a strange sort of punishment for feminists rather than a push towards equity. One post said, and I quote, "It's been 100 years now where they being all women, have managed to weasel their way out of that responsibility. All women should be drafted and put on the front line if war breaks out. But don't worry, ladies, there's a way out. As this Redditor continues, we should give them the option of opting out through giving up their right to vote." I want to begin this speech by saying that I'm not comparing the proposition to these Redditors. Obviously, both sides of this bench prioritize equality and respect for women. However, in the context of this debate, it's important to look at the military for what it is, which is a broken system where sexual violence and misogyny can run rampant, and it's also important to do the same thing with the draft. A draft is an archaic and classist system that lets wealthy people opt out of service and forces the rest of the population to align themselves with an institution that is complicit in, or rather altogether responsible for war crimes and genocide. And this leads me to my first point, and brace yourselves because this is really groundbreaking, but the draft is bad. A draft is, and has always been, coercive and unequal. It historically hits working class people the hardest, and in basically all the cases where it is implemented, there were glaring loopholes for wealthier individuals. Things like educational exemptions and bribery meant that if you had the disposable income to keep paying for school or one-off fees, then you were safe. And it is policies like this that have allowed people like Donald Trump to dodge the draft for a singular war 5 separate times. The draft also directly affects everyone apart from the top 1% who can pay their way out anyway because it internally disrupts the economies of individual families. Like if at any given moment an adult provider of a family can be shipped off to the military, there are obviously very harmful effects, especially when both providers for a household are up for grabs. Like let's imagine a family of 3 with a mom and a dad and a small child, and then both parents get drafted. But I want to make this even more personal for all of us. So let's say this mom is the honorable steward of the 120th session of the University Elizabethan Society, the lovely Loretta Grace Farrell, and this father is her boyfriend Trevor. This child is named some weird Greek name like Andromeda because that's what Loretta told me when I asked her in the arts block today. Where is this child going to get their daily hand-rolled cigarette, and how are they going to figure out what alternative independent artists to use as the background song for their monthly photo dumps? It's easy to see the harms of the draft, but this debate is not about abolishing the draft, it's about including women in it. And as I see it, it's expanding an already unjust system to just include the entire population does not suddenly make it just. The draft should not exist in the first place, and expanding it now of all times just does not make sense. But this leads me to my second point, which is that the military is a uniquely harmful environment for women. Forcing women into a boys' club that has systematically excluded them since its genesis and continuously promotes their abuse, and then slapping a bow on it and calling it equality is not actually equality. In a harrowing report from the BBC in 2023, it was reported that the defense forces in Ireland, at best, barely tolerate women, and at worst, verbally, physically, sexually, and psychologically abuse women in its ranks. And this phenomenon is not one that is unique to the Irish military. 71 to 90% of female service members in the US report experiencing sexual harassment, and reports of assault are just as high. There was a point where a female soldier in Iraq was more likely to be raped by a fellow soldier than killed by enemy fire. These problems exist and they are harmful, but what exacerbates them is the fact that the Army has uniquely inefficient reporting systems and a culture of retaliation against and discouragement from reporting. The Pentagon reports that 80% to 90% of sexual assaults in the military go unreported, and this is because filing charges ruins careers, but not the careers of the assailants, the careers of the victims, who are shamed and ostracized for seeking justice. 8% of cases that are investigated end in prosecution, and 80% of those who are convicted are still honorably discharged. I think the statistics are all it takes to prove that the military is not something that women should be forcibly drafted into. Women have historically been an important part of the military, and there are countless accomplished female combat soldiers, and women deserve the opportunity to pursue any career they want to pursue, but almost every military across the world has a disgusting, glaring, and overlooked sexual assault problem. We should not force anyone into the situation without consent, and the way to rectify this repulsive trend is not to just saturate the military with more women through the draft. People who invoke the gender equality argument for the draft only when it comes to the draft, only when they want company in suffering, do not believe in gender equality. Unless the military becomes inclusive overnight and the draft suddenly stops being harmful, coercive, and classist, expanding it is not progress at all, it's just bad policy. Thank you, and I'm proud to oppose the motion.
Thank you, Jemima, for that very fine speech, and I now invite Layla Cummings to continue this case for side proposition. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, if Ireland was invaded tomorrow, do you think it's smart to look at half the population and say, thanks but no thanks? This motion, this House would make women register for the draft, really comes down to the question of whether or not women are capable of being in traditionally male roles. I would like to think that as a society we would answer that question with a resounding yes. Tonight, I'll begin by prefacing my argument with the fact that if we end up in a scenario where a draft is being instated in the first place, we'd be in no position to be having broader social debates, and instead would have to think as pragmatically as humanly possible. With this in mind, I'll discuss how by pulling from the biggest pool of people, you'll end up with the most capable defence forces and have the highest chance of keeping the country safe. And to finish up, I'll explain how, in the least misandristic way that I can, that women in many ways would actually be more useful in a crisis than men. I want to start by making the point that we are talking about an absolute worst case scenario here. If we got to a point where Ireland has not only made anyone register for the draft, but has actually called upon the people to serve, something has gone unbelievably wrong on an international level. We would have had to have exhausted our own military forces, as well as probably the military forces of other EU member states. So it's not looking good, guys. What I'm trying to say is that if we ended up in this situation, it would be illogical not to utilise half of the population. None of us on the proposition are saying that we want women or men to be put into active duty against their will, but we would be in a situation where Ireland is subject to a serious threat. In other words, the English are probably at it again. I would hope that if we were in this position, the people of Ireland would realise that our freedom is not free and women as well as men have the duty to protect it. If we get down to the brass tacks of it, the liberty and safety of our country has to be the most important thing. Of course, there are arguments to be made about feminism and women's relationship with the military, but unfortunately, if we were quite literally in a war, we wouldn't have the luxury to consider the points brought up by the opposition tonight. Now, it hopefully doesn't come as a surprise to any of you that Ireland is a pretty small country. Roughly 120 countries have a higher population than us, and most of the countries smaller than us don't have the military capacity to attack us anyways. So unless we end up in a war against the Vatican, we need to make sure we have as strong a defence force as possible. Anyone who scrolls on Instagram Reels as much as I do has seen those videos of middle-aged women doing indoor bungee jumping or hopping on tiny trampolines. This is the strength we need on our front lines. This is what those shredded reformer Pilates girls have been training for. Apologies to Senator Tom Clonan, who I'm sure is way too busy to know what that is. But in all seriousness, the idea that women can't register for the draft is based on the narrative that we're physically inferior to men. I'm not denying that biology exists, but again, in a wartime scenario, how can we say that women are, as a rule, physically weak when I'm sure we've all seen the contrary in our own lives? By excluding women from the draft, the normative idea that women cannot be strong, assertive, and powerful is perpetuated. Not only that, but the draft typically includes an array of military roles, not just soldiers. This isn't medieval times. War isn't just about how fast you can run or how strong you are. In the modern age where technology is ubiquitous with combat, the military needs people in cybersecurity, engineering, and mechanics. In Ireland, women represent the majority of people in or graduated from higher education. By not having women register for the draft, we are losing the majority of our most qualified people. When we need our best and brightest the most, why would we not call upon them? As I've said, if Ireland is in need of a draft, we're probably up against it already. So why are we making it harder on ourselves by excluding the bulk of our most qualified candidates? On to my final point. Ladies, I want you to look around the room and look at the women around you. I'm willing to bet that you would trust most of them to hold your drink in the pub while you run to the bathroom. Now, I'm not going to ask you to look at the men in the room because it's going to be a bit mean, but I hope you wouldn't trust a random man to hold your drink. So why are you trusting them to hold a gun unsupervised? I'm sure it's a surprise to no one in the room that men mature slower than women. Especially in the teenage years and early adulthood, psychology, as well as a mountain of anecdotal evidence, shows that women are much more emotionally mature. On average, people are drafted between 18 to 20, and this is the age where the maturity gap is the most obvious. And I don't know if you guys know this, but war is pretty stressful. People in active duty have to have a high level of emotional fortitude. Emotional intelligence is what enables someone to make a hard decision, to strategize, to boost morale. These are all invaluable skills in crisis. Being a competent soldier isn't just about physical strength. You have to be able to make good choices, multitask, think about the consequences of your actions. How many 18 to 20-year-old men do you know who can do any of these things? Any military force, especially in a situation where a draft is needed, could benefit massively from women's ability to act reliably in high-pressure situations. Making women register for the draft would make sure that in the event of a war, Ireland would have a smarter, more sensible army and thus a safer country. Making women register for the draft is common sense. As established, if Ireland has ended up in a situation where we need to call on the people registered for a draft, we are in a crisis and we have no choice but to make sure we have as strong a military as possible. No one wants to go to war, but the freedom and safety of the Irish people, if the freedom and safety of the Irish people were put in jeopardy, of course we would have to act accordingly and not disregard half of the population. Especially in such a small country, we can't afford to cut our talent pool by 50%. By drawing from our entire population, we can make sure that we are as equipped as we can be by having our physically strongest as soldiers and our brightest minds working behind the scenes. Not only that, but we increase the capacity of our defence forces to act calmly and rationally, which I'll reiterate is invaluable in a time of war. Excluding women from the draft ignores logic. It both patronises women by disregarding their capabilities and puts national security at risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla, for that very fine speech, and I now invite Maya Hagstrom to continue the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay. The overpowering rhetoric of our current decade is that remilitarization is back in, increase that defense spending as a percentage of GDP, enter into a bilateral agreement with the US, send a little or kind of a lot of spending money to a gratuitously evil Middle Eastern power. So here I was, considering this prompt, considering the state of NATO, considering Ireland's defense capabilities. To be honest, it wasn't looking that good. But the solution, to make women register for the draft, feels more like a callback to 2010's choice feminism, mutating a collective liberatory movement into a personal issue depending on how good the woman is at performing the job of a man. Did a woman invent the concept of war? Okay, I'm not a historian, I'm just a woman, so I consulted Wikipedia, and it told me that contemporaneous evidence of the first conflicts is very scarce, but the first war on record was the Sumer-Elam War, fought in 2600 BC, and started when the Sumerians, led by King of Kish, invaded Elam, and were victorious. Okay, that feels pretty settled then. Also, the relationship between women and war is historically very complicated. Gender discourse is heightened in wartime. You have these vast, monolithic constructions of an ideal heterosexual family that serves the state in its production of ideal male children who are raised and fight and die for their country, and at home, left behind, are the women that burn in silence and mourn and then eventually die as well. The cycle begins again. So women then often participate in war, not just as fighters, but as victims and grievers. Ideas about femininity are also exploited, often used as a means of warfare. This is because women are often the primary method of propaganda for the state apparatus. How much violence must one nation inflict upon the female bodies of another to necessitate sufficient intervention? How many women is it necessary to harm and kidnap and sexually assault until an opposing side is sufficiently demoralized? Women are simultaneously hypervisible in war, propagandized as rhetorical tools, and yet invisible from traditional historical accounts of warfare. This creates an uncomfortable binary that necessitates women's involvement in war through her body, but negates her ability to participate historically as a warrior or a soldier. Fewer than 1% of women throughout history have been warriors in war. A much greater amount have been impacted by them. Again, I ask, who is responsible for these wars? Statistically, the other 99% not women unaccounted for, men. Women have suffered in war and died in war, and at the end of the day, the natural conclusion is to force them to fight in war. Look, clearly, current trends of the 2020s are trending towards all-out warfare. But if Ireland is going to mandate some kind of militarism, it's clear to me that women should not be involved. So why should we send men to war in our stead? Let's look to our good friend and neighbour across the Irish Sea, Rishi Sunak. Rishi says that national conscription gives the individual the ability to develop real-world skills as they do new things and contribute to their community and our country. Well, if Rishi Sunak sat in the GMB today, I'd ask him to close his eyes and picture this. O'Connell Street, 3 a.m. Young men on their knees, sunken-in faces, slack jaw barely visible, hidden in their Zara trench, slimy and sweating after a night out at the pawn shop, if you're lucky, or coppers, if you're fine with contracting a sexual disease, swarming TCD like sick moths drawn to the flame of intergenerational wealth and the promise of an easy Erasmus fling. Hey, you up? I'm bored. Where'd you end up going last? Guess you went to sleep. Yeah, I went to sleep, it's 3 a.m. And after you don't respond, because you went to bed at a reasonable hour, you wake up and check your phone. Do you feel A, that guttural disappointment like you've just been shoved over from behind and knifed in the back? Or B, do you feel slightly flattered? At least he was thinking about me, right? He went out with his friends, got drunk, came home alone, and his empty bed reminded him of me. Friends, council, members of the Phil, late night what you doing texters, let's just stop playing word association. This is not what Rishi had in mind when he bravely faced the House of Lords and tried to change his country for the better. He wanted men to seek self-improvement, care for others, for their country. These men need to learn commitment, or at least a normal sleep schedule. If all men had to be up at 5 a.m. to do push-ups and put on tight little army uniforms, would they be texting you, I'm outside, when you're snuggled up in bed, warming yourself with your electric blanket and dreaming peacefully? No, they'd be in bed too, cuddling their buddies in the barracks. Okay, so I guess you can say fighting in the military teaches commitment to a cause. At the very least, men would learn how to follow a simple instruction, like, go over there, leave me alone. If you're gonna ditch me for your friends all the time, you may as well date them. Well, at least if you are, I know a couple bunk beds that are looking pretty empty right now, and I'm sure they'd appreciate a couple guys that are willing to give you a try. Maybe they would like a light tap on a steel bed frame, signaling an open sexual spirit and willingness to, what was it Rishi said? Do new things? I'm sure there's a lot of young army bucks willing to put their powerful weapons to good use and do a lot of new things with the average overly judicious, sexually charged, very straight Dublin man. Women are already fighting the good war. Talk about a home front. We're being attacked from all angles here, people. Peacekeepers are storming down the doors of the PAV, negotiating peace talks between that one fresher and her crusty fourth-year boyfriend who studies entrepreneurship and business but claims he's a total trop babe. There are military interventions happening daily in my friends' DMs. Ex-Trinity news editors are publishing think pieces in the papers about the war crimes being committed in diocese. Talk about asymmetrical warfare. Women just don't have a chance here, and you're asking them to go enter the draft, go to war again? God, I mean, sign these men up, Uncle Sam. Put them in. They're practically begging for someone to tell them what to do, for someone to discipline them, teach them. Why does it always have to be women telling them what to do? Why, for once, can't it be the military-industrial complex? Now, Mr. Sunak's dream doesn't just end there. Rishi also says that service penetrates the individual with a sense of national pride. I mean, personally, I would posit that Irishmen already have a sense of unity and belonging to their country. Look around at the 4 men here. They're all already in uniform. I learned what a yup bro was recently, and I'm just gonna say, all of these men marching row by row down Grafton Street in their Nike Tech fleece with their Cillian Murphy taper fade, one chunky stainless steel ring they bought from Urban Outfitters, and an ominous black band worn on their ring finger that their last girlfriend bought for them and they just haven't found the time to take off. They're all already there. You've got the numbers and the cavalry, you've got your troops. All they need is a little bit of encouragement. So, in the words of Rishi Sunak, we will be bold, we will be radical, we will face resistance, and we will meet it. I believe in our Irishmen, and I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you, Maya, for that very fine speech, and I now invite Saeed Kavanagh to conclude the case for side proposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, I promise that this is the only time I will ever stand up here arguing that the government should have more control over women's bodies. But after seeing the Defence Force's recent recruitment ad, I realise they need all the help they can get. Akarja, we have been brought here today to discuss whether or not women should join the draft, which is quite an unusual motion, I think, especially if you're opposition. After all, I expected if the wording was changed ever so slightly to "this House believes women should be teachers" or "this House believes women should be civil servants," it would be far less contentious and probably would land the entire Eliz Council in front of a disciplinary board for even suggesting that perhaps women could not hold these jobs. In fact, I find it quite ludicrous that people would seriously oppose this motion, and I find it even more ludicrous that this remains a topic of debate in the 21st century. We live in an era where we are told that women can do anything. I mean, just look at Barbie. She's a dentist, a soccer player, and can even go to space in heels. But for some reason, the line is drawn when it comes to national service. If we are willing to accept women as presidents and prime ministers, then why do we turn delicate when the conversation pivots to defence? Because historically, participation in national defence has not diminished women's rights, it has accelerated them. Okay, imagine this, it's 1914. I know you don't have to imagine that, but anyway. And everyone says women are too emotional for politics. Then a war starts and kaboom. Okay, maybe that's in poor taste. But the government asks, actually, could you please run some ammunition factories? It's amazing how persuasive competence can be. When women become indispensable to the state, it is politically impossible to ignore them. And so, a few years later, women were granted the right to vote. This pattern has continued throughout history. After the Second World War, when there was an increased need for women to work to fulfil the spots of men who had gone to fight, because, the draft doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be fighting on the front line. This only advanced, the second wave feminist movement. Women were seen as capable and competent in the eyes of men. But before the opposition jumps in and accuses me of appeasing men, listen, I've never done anything for male validation in my life, including this outfit. But honestly, if it were up to women to decide whether they could vote or not, it probably would have happened a long time before. In reality, it was up to men, and more specifically, it was up to men in power. Okay, so fast forward to now, the big 26. Really, the world is quite unpredictable at the moment. Donald Trump regained power, foreign politicians are being kidnapped from their countries in plain sight, and even more shockingly, Trisha Paytas has finally beaten cancel culture and now is a renowned podcaster / homemaker. I mean, what the hell? But seriously, war could break out at any second. It could be breaking out now. Who knows who's invading Irish shores? Americans, English people? Nah. I mean, don't half of you have American passports anyway? Okay, props to you, successful invasion. But honestly, Ireland's defence forces are in a crisis state. As an island nation, we only have 700 in the Navy and 750 in the Air Force. So, if in the morning conscription became a thing again and it only applied to men, I would ask why. Why would we, as a small island nation with a clearly devastated army, not draft another half of the population? Like, seriously, I know a lot of us are art students, but that's big numbers, people. Now look, I'm fully aware this debate is not about militarisation, and I'm not I'm not promoting militarisation. We need to be able to defend ourselves. But these numbers are the practicalities that the opposition have decided to gloss over and ignore. History proves it. Competence makes equality unavoidable. The difference today, the government is still acting like half the population is too fragile to pick up a rifle, which, to be honest, is almost as unreliable as expecting Earnod Aaron to run on time. Now, I know what the opposition will say and have said. They'll say and have said, armies have had problems with gender-based violence, and they're correct. Many militaries around the world have failed women, from the highest levels to the lowest ranks. But the solution to discrimination is not exclusion. We did not solve sexism in Parliament by banning women from becoming members. We did not solve workplace violence by staying home. If the opposition's argument is that women should not be drafted because it is unsafe, then they're suggesting that we should preserve a male-dominated institution rather than reform it. We don't reform institutions by minimising. If that were the case, the HIST would be thriving right now. But okay, if we are going to tell women that they can be astronauts, gymnasts, or even Trisha Paytas-level celebrities, then I think we can also decide that women can be drafted. Because selective equality is exhausting. Either we can do it all or we can't do anything. If women are considered equal to their male counterparts, this extends to rights, to not only rights, but also responsibilities. Otherwise, these rights are hollow. And if conscription did come into place tomorrow and women were for some reason excluded, you simply couldn't grant a seat. We simply wouldn't, I suppose, be seen as being equal because we wouldn't be sharing the full burden of citizenship. Like, come on. Rights without responsibility, that's like expecting Earnod Aaron to run on time. I don't know why I have so many train jokes in here. Like, yes, it's theoretically possible, but it is most certainly not going to happen anytime soon. This type of selective equality is thoroughly damaging to the feminist movement. Saying that we can do anything but military service implies that we are fragile, yet somehow we are sturdy enough to run economies, an entire feminist movement, and even the Eliz. Okay. So, Akarja, I'll leave you off with one final image. Picture this, my ideal future. Just joking. It's draft day. Women show up. RTE is filming. The opposition is in meltdown, and my grandmother, who has survived having 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and saying the Angelus twice daily, like I know, she's basically the Irish Kris Jenner, simply shrugs and says, "They'll be grand." Thank you, and I urge you all to vote the proposition.
For that very fine speech, and I now invite Senator Tom Clonan to close the case for side opposition and the debate as a whole.
I don't know how I'm going to do on time. I'm going to try and be as quick as I can because I have so much to say. But first of all, thank you for inviting me here to speak, and I consider it a great privilege to be here, and thanks for allowing me to contribute. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself so that you can put a context on what I have to say to you here today. So I grew up in Figlas and I did my Leaving Cert in 1984 and I was privileged to come here to Trinity. So I was here in Trinity, graduated in 1988, and then I joined the Defence Forces. Now, I went in as a cadet, was commissioned, but I think the critical faculties that I was privileged to be socialised into here in Trinity as part of my intellectual formation. It allowed me to not just be immersed in military culture, but to kind of reflect on it and critique it. So I did all the things you'd expect. I served in what we called Aid to the Civil Power Operations, armed support operations for An Garda Síochána during the Troubles. We did arrests, surveillance, searches, extraditions. I participated in the extradition of an individual who is now a TD, and we sit in a committee together. And I said it to him one day, you know, I held you at gunpoint, and we have a laugh about it. I then went to the Middle East. I was in Lebanon during a very violent deployment where, I'm sorry to say, hundreds and hundreds of Lebanese innocent men, women and children were slaughtered. I was in the former Yugoslavia at the end of that conflict. So I have experience of conflict. And I saw the beginnings of what we now see today in Gaza, in Ukraine, where the civilian population is the target. Okay? And the principal victims of modern urban conflict are women and children and the elderly. You know, we've had tens of thousands of children, women. It's sororicide, it's femicide, it's infanticide. That's what conflict is about. And as a species, we have to do better. Final thing about my military service, I did a PhD while I was in the army, I did my doctorate, and I looked at the experiences of my female colleagues. And unfortunately, it revealed that there were shockingly high levels of sexual violence against female soldiers in the defence forces. To give you an example, I interviewed a maximum variation sample of 60 of my colleagues. 59 out of the 60 reported some form of sexual assault, up to and including rape. 59 out of 60. A lot of militaries are toxic organisations, and I volunteered to be in it. Those women that I served with volunteered, and it was tough and it was toxic. I wouldn't draft anyone. I wouldn't force anyone to be in an environment like that, and particularly in the context of conflict. So the military rejected my findings. The military authorities said that I'd falsified the findings, fabricated the research, and they also accused me of breaching the Official Secrets Act, which is a criminal offence. So what I say to you about feminist theory, enjoy it sensibly, because it ruined my military career. So before I get on to the substantive issue, I just want to mention my grandmother. Okay, so my grandmother was born in 1900, Mairead Begley. She was born in Kerry. She came up to Dublin in 1916 to become a primary school teacher. She was radicalised by the events of 1916, and she joined Cumann na mBan. So in 1919, she qualified as a teacher and she got a job in Sculbhríde. It was the first Gael school in Ireland, and at the time it was up in Stephen's Green. I think it's out in Ranelagh now. So the War of Independence breaks out, and she's attached to the South Dublin Brigade of the IRA. And she participated in targeted killings, abductions and kidnappings of people in the South County Dublin unionist-leaning community. They did a lot of arson attacks. They burnt down the police station, as it was then, in Blackrock, Dunleary, Dundrum, Blessington, Greystones, Bray. So she was a typical woman, multitasker, school teacher by day, and arsonist and freedom fighter at night. So when she retired in 1965, she came to live with us, and she took me out every day and spoilt me rotten. She was the only, she used to smoke a pipe, which is unusual. So I knew that women played a role in the liberation of the state, the War of Independence, and the Civil War. Women have played a hyperactive role in conflict for thousands of years, but there's a constructed masculinity around military service which is completely false, and it's designed to attract foolish young men like me into what is essentially a death profession. So I'm going to go back to the urban rebellions of 1848, Paris, Vienna, Rome, Berlin. Contemporary reports of the Paris Commune uprising in 1871 say that there were horrifying detachments of women carrying broomsticks, lances, pitchforks, swords, pistols, and muskets. Women. Don't mess with the women. In the US Revolution, people like Deborah Sampson posed as a man and identified as her husband, Robert Shirtliff. She was injured several times, but she operated on herself with a penknife, because if you knew that if she went to a military hospital, they would discover that she was a woman. So there's this suppressed history of women's involvement in conflict. I'm coming to this from a liberal feminist perspective, but I want to conclude on a point about that. The US Civil War, you had all these characters. Jefferson Davis commissioned Sally Louise Tompkins as a captain because of her particularly violent and passionate nature. You had spies, Belle Boyd, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, Pauline Cushman for the Union and for the Confederate side. Harriet Tubman, who was an abolitionist, a spy, a scout, and a guide for the Union. And I love these names. Mad Anne Bailey, who fought for the Union. Mrs. L.M. Blakelock of the 29th Carolina Militia, who posed as her brother-in-law. Sarah Taylor, have you heard of her? The Tennessee Joan of Arc. LaBelle Morgan, Molly Pitchers. Look around the room at the women. Don't mess with the women. Michigan Bridget. Who was she? Nancy Slaughter Walker. I think the clue is in the name. Captain Molly. Loretta Velasquez. Mary Lovell, who was the captain of the Union ship, the Moonraker, which captured the Confederate ship, the J.P. Ellicott, in 1863. As I say, the women are the deadlier of the species. Russia, Sebastopol, 1830, the uprising against the Tsar. 375 women were sentenced to death. In World War I, the Tsar formed women's formations in World War I, and they were called battalions of death. And they were particularly feared by the Germans and Austrians that encountered them on the battlefield. And there's one contemporary account from a woman called Maria Yashka, who says, I came to a very large German, I ran him through with my bayonet, shot him, and then I took his helmet as a souvenir. In the Russian Revolution in 1917 in Petrograd, contemporary accounts describe hundreds of women who came onto the streets to fight the Tsar's forces, malnourished and deformed from poverty and from really, really hard work. And it spooked the Cossacks, and the Cossacks retreated. So contemporary reports say it was the involvement of women in the Petrograd uprising that swung it in favour of the revolutionaries. In World War II, 800,000 women served in the Soviet military. 800,000. They had all-female units that have been forgotten in historical accounts of World War II. Because in Ireland, we talk about the men of 1916, the men of 98, the men and boys who fought in World War I, and to women were hyperactive in their participation. You had units like the 586th Women's Air Fighter Regiment, the 46th Night Bomber Regiment, particularly hazardous form of aerial combat. They were known as the Night Witches by the Germans. I think it's called Nachtenhexen or something. But they were particularly feared because women are multitaskers. And let me tell you, in the contemporary military, in air forces around the world, because of the way in which women are socialised, they're multitaskers. So they can fly the plane, operate the navigation system, hit the right target with the weapon systems, and land the plane safely. How novel. So whenever I fly, when I look in the cockpit, if I see a woman on the flight deck, I go, we're going to get there. And we're going to get back. Because it's been proven that the military aren't some sort of socialist feminist experiment. They're recruiting women in ever greater numbers because they know that they make for better and more efficient soldiers. I know I'm sorry about the time. I'll be as quick as I can. I just want to be really clear about the role that women have played in conflict. In Germany, the Nazis' patriarchal system, the Führer, the father, the Vaterland, women were to be taken out of the workplace. So they had a bounty which they paid to women at the beginning of World War II in Germany, 1,000 Deutschmarks, to get them out of the workforce and into the home to be Hausfrauen and have Kinder for the Fatherland. So in 1942, they reduced the number of women in the workplace right down to 2%. And then when Russia invaded them, they conscripted and forced women back into the workforce, so that by 1945, 56% of the workforce in Germany were female, because they knew that if you want to win, if you want to have a proper hospital, it has to be gender integrated. If you want to have a proper university, it has to be gender integrated. If you want to win a war, it has to be gender integrated. They conscripted them. And the same in Russia. And just to say, Russia had to move all of its heavy industry after the Germans invaded, east of the Urals into the Baku oil fields. That oil and steel industry was rebuilt by women. And the production records of women in the 1940s and 50s were never equaled by men in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the USSR, despite mechanization and technological. Women work hard. The idea that women are feminine or this is a complete and utter myth. It's a kind of a hyper-masculine idea around conflict and combat that has no basis in fact. In Yugoslavia, Balkan, Peninsula. Hitler sent 12 divisions, SS, Panzer divisions, to crush the partisans. 100,000 of those were women. 25,000 of those women were killed. 25,000 of the partisans in Italy were women. So it's not, we don't read about this in our history books. We hear about men, the great men who did this, that, and the other, but it was women. I just want to be really quick then. Vietnam, 40% of the North Vietnamese army who fought the Americans were women. 40%. Women and girls. There was a sniper school run by Madame Din La Tun in Min Top. It was called the Sniper School for Girls. And the girls were given 1 round of ammunition. And with that, they had to kill an American and then get up and take his weapon. So an all-male, hyper-masculine US Marine Corps Semper Fi were defeated by a force of women and girls. So in Desert Storm, the Americans, learning from their encounters with the enemy, per se, 41,000 women fought in the Gulf War. Now, I met one of those women in Shannon Airport. She was part of the US Air Force display team, which is called, I think it's called the Thunderbirds or something. In order to be on that display team, you have to have combat experience. You have to literally be a Top Gun, like the movie, that paean to homoerotic hypermasculinity. So one of the women pilots, she had combat experience. I just want to tell you this, and then I'll conclude. She told me that she had 4 small children. She'd done a PhD. She was, what's that song by Shaka Khan? She was I'm Every Woman. She was one of the Americans' top fighter pilots. She told me that during the invasion of Iraq, when they were pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein, they had taken the airport and she was flying close support to US armoured formations who were moving towards Place de la Martyre, centre of Iraq, and Baghdad. And when she took off from the airport, she had just got up to about 2,000 or 3,000 feet when somebody fired a shoulder-launched missile and the projectile hit her plane. And luckily for her, the warhead didn't detonate, but the kinetic energy of the missile warped the airframe. And she said, I struggled to control the aircraft. I had to reconfigure all of the sort of characteristics of the aircraft to keep it in the air. She said, I was terrified. I couldn't eject. Imagine a US military pilot, a woman, ejecting out into Baghdad as the Americans are approaching. She would have been, anyway. And she couldn't, she had to try and maintain altitude. So eventually she got control of the aircraft and she was able to stabilize it. And she said to me, and then, sorry, Ellie, she said, and then I had a thought. And I thought she was going to say to me, I thought of my 4 children and what am I doing here? And I said, what was your thought? And she said, I think I have enough fuel to go around and kill that motherfucker who fired the missile at me. And then she looked at me with her pale green eyes and her eyeshadow and her perfect hair, and she said, and that's what I did. So women are well capable of combat. So from the liberal feminist perspective, and I am going to conclude, Ellie, from the liberal feminist perspective, the military is seen as a legitimate, valid social institution. Liberal feminism would probably, to some extent, look at NATO and say it has been a legitimate instrument of deterrence. It has probably kept the peace in Europe and prevented aggression and so on. And that probably would be where my grandmother was in terms of her views of, taking to the streets at the age of 19, setting fire to police stations, participating in kidnappings. My daughter's 21. If I heard she was doing that, I'd be so annoyed. Anyway, but the radical feminist perspective, and as I get older and having seen conflict at first hand, the radical feminist perspective holds that, we shouldn't have armies. Our species is at such risk, and I've said this before in these rooms, the planet, the prospect of global conflict, the prospect of a nuclear exchange, the only hope we have as a society, as a species, I think, is the empowerment of women and girls, because patriarchy has failed. And the military is a pristine expression of the patriarchal system. And so therefore, I would say, when they introduced the National Service Act in Britain in 1940, 350,000 English women volunteered They didn't need to conscript them. So I would say you don't need conscription. We don't want conscription. It's not good for either men or for women. And my final, and that's the radical feminist perspective, and that's one that, as a retired army officer, I would adhere to. And I just want to say one last thing to you, and thank you so much for your patience. There's a growing level of misinformation and a narrative evolving in Ireland that we need to get rid of the triple lock, and that our neutrality is somehow embarrassing, or that it's not a mature position. Our partners don't care about our neutral status, and we need to be very careful that we don't lose it. And I would say to each and every one of you, and to our intergenerational representation here, talk to your TDs, talk to your senators. Do not allow Ireland to dilute its neutral status. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator, for that very fine speech, and thank you to all speakers for speaking here tonight. Before we go to a vote, just a reminder that we'll have a wine reception next door in Convo, and afters will be at O'Regan's. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to shout aye if you support the motion and nay if you oppose. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Nay. The nays have it. The motion falls.